Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our worst map ever series with the map Pradesh. Now, I have had a few different requests for Pradesh, and one of the issues with trying to do a map review with this particular map is that, well, it doesn't come up in the matchmaker for me all that much, and when it does come up, a lot of my games aren't really that interesting in it. For that reason, some of the footage that you'll see in the background is actually footage that I have used in the past just because I felt the footage was pretty representative, and also it is a pretty good game on the map of Pradesh, so bear with me on that one. Now, one thing I will be trying with this particular map review is I will be going into a custom battle with a cute little XM800T to show you some of the key positions that I'm talking about as I'm talking about them to help you get a slightly better idea of what we're looking at. I like to use live server gameplay where possible because it shows not just the position itself but how it can potentially be used, but if I don't have a good example of live server gameplay, a custom battle might work. I don't know, you'll have to give me some feedback on that one at the end of this video. This does also lead into one of the more unusual aspects of Pradesh as a map. Currently, Pradesh has two major subvariants in the game, and what's really unique is not just that it has two subvariants, but both of them are 3-cap maps, and both of them occur at slightly different battle ratings. The one on the left occurs only at 7.7 to 8.7, a single battle rating increment, which is kind of crazy, and the one on the right actually occurs at 9.0 and above. So that's part of the reason why I almost never see the one on the left, because you have to be playing at a very specific battle rating bracket for it to even be eligible to show up in your game. As far as I'm aware, Pradesh is the only map wherein Gaijin does this. Most other maps have at least 2 or 3 subvariants, and if they do have subvariants, usually they're at the same battle rating, or they'll have a bigger version of the map at a higher battle rating. This is the only version of this map I can think of where the two variants are effectively the same size and both of them are 3-cap maps, and the separation between them is very small. Now, one thing to note about Pradesh is that the map is not as big as it looks like it is. If you look at the key in the bottom right hand corner, it looks like the map is about 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers, and strictly speaking that's kind of correct, but you also notice there's a ton of mountains on the outside that are not part of the map boundary, so there's actually a lot of that area that simply cannot be used for anything. So in practice, it's more of a large mid-size map rather than a map that's closer to something like Big Tunisia or Volcalemps or Red Desert, etc. Now, I'm going to pull up this essentially promotional thing Gaijin did for the map of Pradesh because there is one very important feature that you need to understand about this map before you can start realistically talking about it, and that is that Pradesh is essentially a giant bowl, and I've said that about a few different maps in the past, but Pradesh really emphasizes this because you can see ringing the map, especially with the dam region in the lower left-hand corner, there is a road and a rail line that basically runs around the entire outside of the map, and the entire interior of the map is at a lower elevation. This means that a lot of the lines of sight on this map can actually get pretty long, so even though Pradesh isn't that big of a map if you compare it to something like Volcalemps, the lines of sight you can get are quite long. Additionally, this basically means the entire middle of the map is essentially a giant crossfire because you're going to have people sitting on camping spots all around this bowl that are just taking shots across it. So this makes the middle of the map pretty difficult to use, not impossible, I'll go into that a little bit more later, but it is something you really have to keep in mind when playing Pradesh. Now, when you're looking at the capture points on Pradesh, it's important to remember that 2 of them are universal to both variants and 2 of them are not. Basically, all of them are A, B, and C, but both maps use a slightly different arrangement of A, B, and C. As far as the left of center point, or the A point on this particular minimap, it's kind of an interesting position because there's a raised road with a bridge that basically runs alongside A. This does allow you with some cover because the ground next to the raised road is recessed, so even though you can be sniped from a wide array of positions, you do have some capacity to at least take cover. The major issue I keep running into whenever I go to this particular capture point is the capture point is just barely small enough that you can't fully hide yourself behind the raised road in order to prevent yourself from getting shot basically from the enemy's spawn. This is the biggest weakness to this capture point, at least if you're from the southern spawn. If you're from the northern spawn, it's actually a lot more difficult for the enemy to get line of sight to you unless they're taking the areas on the far right hand side of the map where they might have line of sight basically to cross map you. With that being said, this capture point does have a pretty unreasonable amount of open ground in basically all areas around it, so the likelihood that you'll get all the way to it without getting shot is pretty low unless you just get lucky with a rotation, or unless it's late enough in the map and the enemy teams have been thinned out enough that they're not necessarily watching every line of sight. Additionally, once you take this capture point, your routes off of it are not particularly good either. There often isn't that much to do other than just hope you get another good rotation to get to another part of the map, such as the right hand side near B, etc, etc. So overall, the A capture point often goes long stretches of the game uncaptured, or if one team does capture it, they often keep it for the remainder of the game. The right of center capture point is a little more interesting. It's the B point on this particular minimap. To the north and south of it, you basically have villages on little mountain passes. However, the villages are not accessible. However, the large rock formations that these villages are on do provide you at least some potential cover. That being said, there is quite a bit of driving through what is essentially water to get there, and this does make it pretty awkward to approach this point in the first place. On top of that, once you're on the B capture point, you're not exactly safe because a lot of the elevated positions in and around the C point to your immediate right can actually see onto the B point reasonably well. It's not impossible to hide, but you do have to be fully aware that the C point can see onto the B capture point. With that being said, the point is both easier to get onto and off of than the A capture point, and a lot of this just comes down to the large rock formation to the immediate right. It limits the amount of open ground you have to go through to get to the capture point, so especially if your team is controlling those rock formations to the right of B, you have a much easier chance of getting to it and then getting off of it and doing something useful. The capture point on the far right on this particular map, and on the mini-map this is the C capture point, is actually pretty interesting as well because it's on basically a giant ledge and it's essentially in the open. There's no real cover, but it's also a little awkward to see onto it depending on what parts of the map the enemy does or does not control. That being said, it's still one of those capture points you don't want to be on it for longer than you have to, but the routes to get onto it are a little more accessible than A and B simply because you have more options to avoid line of sight from the entire enemy team. You're not driving through large open fields or large stretches of water. On top of that, if you do actually capture the C point successfully, getting back off of it and doing something useful is pretty handy. You basically just drove back the way you came to the right hand side of the map, and there are plenty of roads, gullies, etc. that you can use to make plays and actually do something interesting. Really, the only reason why the C capture point frequently goes uncaptured is because the C capture point itself is exceedingly exposed, so trying to stay on it long enough to capture it, especially because you're at the battle rating with thermals and laser rangefinders, can be a little tricky. If you can do it, however, it's not that bad. Briefly flashing to the slightly lower version of the Pradesh map, and what we actually see here is that on this mini-map it is called the A capture point. It's on the far left hand side. This is actually on a riverbank, and the riverbank itself provides a fairly solid amount of cover. Additionally, there's also a rail bridge going past it that has large support columns, and those support columns also provide a good bit of cover as well. The bigger issue you're going to run into is that the approach to it is pretty exposed for basically both sides, and trying to get off of it can be a little awkward, but it does at least offer probably the best cover out of all the capture points we've talked so far once you're actually on it. Additionally, once you capture it, getting off of it and doing useful things, pushing out to your opponent's side of the map, is actually not that difficult either. So I would say out of all of the capture points we've talked about, this is probably the most viable to take and also get off of successfully, but Pradesh is a weird map in that a lot of the capture points are just not that conducive to easily getting onto or off of. This also leads to another interesting point in that frequent viewers of the channel will know that I do get annoyed at teammates that pop smoke excessively, but this is one of those maps where so many of the capture points are so exposed that it does kind of benefit you to pop smoke because you simply can't check all of the different angles that you need to at all times in order to capture a lot of these points. This is also where the main movement lanes of Pradesh come into play, because the main movement lanes of Pradesh are basically just the road and rail lines. When your map consists of a lot of steep hills, rock formations, and water obstacles, players tend to follow the road a lot more than they don't, and by following this road, even if you're not staying on it, just by staying on the other side of the road to get at least some degree of cover against incoming fire, it does mean that most of the major movement lanes either follow the railroads or the actual driving roads. The center of Pradesh basically lacks any viable movement lanes, or I would say consistently viable movement lanes. Certainly if you're later in the map you can get it, and if you're really early in the map you can sometimes get good rotations when people are not really set up, up. But generally speaking, I would say the various rail and roads are usually what you need to be watching if you're looking for enemy movement. There are a few other spots that are frequented by enemy teams, but usually if somebody needs to get around Pradesh, they're probably following one of the major roads, because a lot of the other options are just too much difficult terrain or too exposed. Now, speaking of movement lanes overall, there is this one lane that I really want to emphasize that's kind of situational, doesn't get used all that often. A lot of people don't even seem to know it exists, but there is essentially an underground tunnel right beneath the C point that both sides have access to. Because the C capture point is essentially a plinth that juts out from the main version of the map, that means that on both sides of it there are essentially these large recessed roads that you can use. And while you can certainly go all the way around the plinth for the C cap, there is also a road directly beneath it that does have some water obstacles in it, so if your vehicle is amphibious, it might act a little weird if you go here, especially the EFV. The EFV goes into full amphibious mode, but that's a whole other discussion. Anyway, there is this one road that you can use that actually is a bit of a shortcut and that not many people know about. Now, as far as overall power positions, Pradesh is kind of the opposite of Volcalimps. Volcalimps doesn't really have power positions because every position is counterable, but on Pradesh, because the entire map is ringed by a road and a rail line, and that road and that rail line is slightly raised, it means the entire area of that road and that rail line provides essentially good cover to anybody using it to snipe at you. So this means that the entire outside ring of Pradesh is effectively a giant power position that can be used to dominate large sections of the map. However, there is this one hill right next to C in particular that you'll see in the background. This has a very dominant position across the vast majority of Pradesh. Now, this hill that I'm on in the background has actually changed a bit. It used to be a lot easier to use even if you didn't have great gun depression. Now it's a little more awkward. They've slightly changed how the contours work, they've added some trees, etc, etc, but it is still a very dominant position if you can use it, and especially a lot of the ATGM carriers, things like the AFTI or the Mephisto that only have a small turret to poke up over terrain and also have naturally good gun depression, can generally use this position very well. But even then, really any tank with thermals and a laser rangefinder can absolutely rail an enemy from all the way across the map from on top of this one hill. So this naturally leads into the discussion of how do you play Pradesh, and normally I would look more at the heavy tank gameplay, but seeing as how most heavy tanks have basically started to go extinct at around the same time you see Pradesh, the lower version of Pradesh can appear at 7.7 to 8.7, so you still have some heavy tanks lingering around there, but the main version of Pradesh is 9.0 and above, so you don't generally have any heavy tanks. If you are in a slower moving vehicle, honestly, you're probably better off at the C point, because the C point is generally where you have more limited lines of sight, you have more control over lines of sight, and you have more options to close the distance with the enemy. You can use your armor effectively in a heavy tank at a lot of the recessed roads if you're just showing the turret or the upper plate or things of that nature. However, you're also at a battle rating where a lot of things have kinetic rounds or heat rounds that have high penetration, a lot of things have basic rangefinders or even laser rangefinders. So your armor is not as reliable even at longer distances on Pradesh as it would be on a normal map. Heavy tanks I do feel like are probably one of the weaker things you can spawn on Pradesh, even if you do have a heavy tank that can see it, something like the T-58 or the Object 279. For a lot of the tank destroyers, there are quite a few positions in and around the ring. You'll kind of get a feel for it as you play the map, but in these positions, the tank destroyers can just poke their turret up, see large swaths of the map, up to and including in many cases the enemy's spawn zone, and can simply rain missiles down on them from relative impunity. And especially if you're at very long range, while being at very long range is a double-edged sword for a lot of these turreted tank destroyers, because what it essentially means is that your missile takes longer to get to the enemy, so there's a higher likelihood they leave line of sight. It also means it's almost impossible to hit your launcher. Even with thermals and a laser rangefinder, it's often hard to see and pick them out at a distance. So there are a lot of positions that these annoying tank destroyers that have these hammerhead turret type designs can actually use efficiently. As the main battle tanks are generally going to comprise the majority of both teams around these battle ratings, the best advice to MBTs is that you really want to get into any of the good positions you can, either the hills in and around C, any of the power positions around the map, or just find any of the roads or railways that aren't being observed by the enemy that you can use to push forward. Certainly MBTs are good enough to both brawl and snipe on this map, but you really want to be focusing on that versatility. As far as the light tanks on this map, a lot of the little positions and the little cuts in the road that you can use to basically sneak into positions are really going to be your bread and butter. Positions like the one I showed you that go under the C point can be great ways to surprise opponents, get in unexpected angles, and that's really what you want a light tank with superior mobility to be doing on this map. While certainly a lot of them can snipe, you're not really making the best use out of the vehicle because the MBTs that tend to have the more robust turret armor are a lot better in those positions. While you can certainly go up with something like a Stingray and start sniping across the map, an Abrams that can actually take the turret hits and likely not die is going to be a better choice for that particular position. As far as my overall thoughts on Pradesh, I generally don't love it or don't hate it. It feels like most of the positions have at least some form of counterplay. The roads allow for efficient movement around the map and also allow you to basically get off the road at any time to go into interesting locations. The most awkward part about Pradesh for me when playing it is how difficult it is to get onto and off of many of the capture points, and additionally the fact that Pradesh has a large interior space that often is very difficult to use. I honestly think if the mountains around the B point were just a lot bigger in terms of both length and height, to where they blocked a lot more line of sight, the map would actually open up quite a bit, because that would do a pretty efficient job of essentially cutting it in half so you couldn't simply bisect the entire map with a single line of sight. And in my humble opinion, that is kind of the weakest point of Pradesh, is that a lot of the aspects of the map you can see all the way from one side to the other because it is effectively a giant bowl. So it often feels like your movement options are artificially limited by this, whereas if you just had some larger rock formations in the middle to block that line of sight, I feel like it would allow for much better movement and a lot more play in the center. For me personally, as a higher tier map that lets some of the MBTs stretch their legs, I think it's fine, but I always dislike maps where it feels like there's large swaths of it that you simply can't use reliably because the lines of sight are simply too exposed. But those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of the map Pradesh. Do you love it? Do you hate it? I always love to hear from you guys. Additionally, give me any feedback of like what you think about using the custom battles to essentially show you some of the capture points or some of the key positions. Does that help you a lot? Do you not really care? Again, I appreciate your feedback on that. If you liked the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.